Welcome, everyone, to this event on knowledge and expertise in vocational education and training, a subject that has been central to, we used to talk about post-compulsory education. But for some time, however, these questions of knowledge and expertise have been subordinated to questions of how teaching takes place, of the learner experience, of generic knowledge, and a whole range of ways in which vocational pathways were constructed as a sphere in which procedural knowledge had no significant role. And that's all changed significantly in many of the English-speaking countries where knowledge was most marginalized. And we can see that in Britain today. We see that in the Ofsted Common Inspection Framework, for example. We see a revival of interest in the sources of knowledge and expertise, and the idea, sometimes inflated with the kind of hypermodern discourses of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, for example. We see knowledge and expertise firmly back on the agenda, but sometimes in simplified and sometimes even in divisive ways, in which it's considered important for some students, but not for others. In this session today, we're bringing together 4 international experts in this field to examine these questions, not from a sterile or scholastic point of view, but to bring together the insights of theory with philosophical, historical, sociological, and of course educational insights to explore some of the ways in which knowledge draws on and flows into different locations, different sources, and we're bringing together 4 very different insights into this area. The speakers today have one thing in common. They're contributors to a special issue of the Journal of Vocational Education and Training, the oldest and the most important of the journals that reports research on technical and vocational education and training. There's a special issue on knowledge and expertise that will be the first issue of that journal next year, but actually all of the papers are online, and I think nearly all of the speakers have included a link to their contribution to that special issue. So we're going to hear from four speakers, and maybe we can move the slide on to look at their pictures, or maybe we can't. Okay, the 4 speakers will be Jim Horden from the University of Bath, who is going to be talking about specialization. So, oh, there they are, excellent. And systematization and vocational expertise. Chris Winch from King's College London, who's going to be talking about forming professional judgment. We've got Aina Talabini and Judith Zhukovkis, who are going to be talking about tracking knowledge and the organisation of secondary schooling. Finally, we have Gavin Moody from the University of Toronto, who is going to be talking about sources of vocational expertise. So this isn't going to be by any means a dry discussion. There's quite a mix of people here today. Some of you I know have followed these debates intently over many years and are familiar with the material of at least some of the speakers and the arguments and discussion that we're going to hear today. Some of you will be newer to some of these things, and if you're not already involved in the BERA post-16 and lifelong learning special interest group. I urge you to join and get involved in it. If you're not a regular reader of the journal where these papers appear, again, I urge you to subscribe, to follow what's in the journal on a regular basis. But if you're not sure about any of those things, I'm sure you won't find a better taster for them than the event that's taking place today. So thanks everyone for your patience while we're getting that on the road and through the technical hitches, and I'll hand over to Jim.
Thank you very much, Bill, for that introduction. As Bill says, many of the papers here today, presented here today, are closely related to papers in the special issue of the Journal of Vocational Education and Training. I should say from the outset that my paper is not that closely related to the paper I contributed to in the special issue, although some elements of it do pick up some of the points in that paper too. So what I'm going to be talking about is specialization, systematization, and the vocational curriculum. And I'm hoping I can move on. Ah, yes, here we are. So the questions that I'm raising in this presentation are what we mean by specialized knowledge and practice, what we mean by systematic knowledge. I'm going to discuss the notion of systematic revisability, which has been raised by some other authors in relation to questions of knowledge and expertise and the curriculum. And then I'm going to try and ask what this means for the vocational curriculum specifically. So the key argument that I'm trying to get across here is that the current and future vocational curriculum needs to consider some of these changing patterns of specialization and systematization, and to consider the practices that these give rise to. Just a bit of background. So why am I interested in specialized knowledge? Well, this discussion emerged through an exchange of short papers in the London Review of Education on the topic of powerful knowledge, which is an idea that was introduced by Michael Young, Joe Muller, and Lisa Wheelahan, and others. And in a paper in the London Review of Education, John White advocates an end to the idea of powerful knowledge and instead a focus on the notion of specialized knowledge, acknowledging a suggestion that I had made in an earlier paper that the idea of specialized knowledge needed further discussion as not necessarily an alternative to the idea of powerful knowledge, but a useful notion which we needed greater discussion and elaboration on. So what we mean by specialized knowledge in the economy, well, we could argue that this is constantly changing. The idea of specialized knowledge is constantly changing. Whatever we have in terms of our position on the fourth industrial revolution, and Bill's already mentioned that, that's obviously a debate that's going on in policy circles. What are the implications for work in the future, and how might that change how we might need to prepare some of our learners for future roles in the economy? And people are taking various positions on that. Some people think the fourth industrial revolution is not quite a revolution. It's more a continuation, more an incremental progression, whereas others see it as a much more radical development. So in terms of specialization and social change, to sort of introduce a Durkheimian perspective here, we could argue that social bonds, social memory, and notions of collective identity are generated throughout societies, if you look back in history, through the development of symbolic forms of various types, or what Durkheim calls the sacred. So we might argue that all societies require this notion of the symbolic for a sense of the collective and development of solidarity, whether these societies are undifferentiated or have a more specialized division of labor. And when I say undifferentiated, I mean in the sense that each individual within the society may have a range of different roles, A more specialized division of labor entails that people have a much more specific occupation and contribution to society that they are prepared for, often through long periods of education and training. However, I think it's very important to acknowledge that it's very difficult to consider that these symbolically organized notions stay static for long periods of time. All societies are challenged by new ideas constantly, or by new technologies, and that means that disruption, I think, is often a constant feature of any society. And that means that societies need to get used to reconfiguring what they mean by the symbolic, or reconfiguring what they mean by specialized knowledge all the time. So when that solidarity is disrupted, new forms of differentiation and specialization emerge as a challenge to the established order, and a process of transition needs to take place. And I think that's certainly the case in contemporary societies across the world at present. So if we look back into history, and certainly into European history, although I think this is true of many societies around the world, we could argue that forms of specialization developed within many societies over the pre-modern, early modern period as a consequence of an impetus for new technology, attempts to improve the quality of life, or the development of novel strategies for executing tasks. And sometimes the impetus for this has come through conflict or warfare, the need to defend your territory against others, or the desire to acquire new property to improve the standard of living for your community. And this relates slightly to some of the things that Gavin is going to talk about in his presentation later on, in terms of the development of knowledge relating to some of these technologies. But also forms of trade and exchange, the innovations of different social groups, intermingling of different societies, introduces new ideas and sometimes disrupts the status quo and creates new opportunities for specialized knowledge, and also new processes of circulating and distributing that knowledge. So specialization is often resulting in new categorizations of knowledge and new techniques of circulating, moving, conveying that knowledge to different people within society. We have some excellent examples of this in the work of Valeriani and others, looking at the history of the development of practical knowledge. For example, there's an interesting work that's been done on the circulation of architectural knowledge in the early modern period through the use of annotated notebooks, in which these notebooks were passed between different novice architects and expert architects, who overlaid existing drawings with new annotations and additions that could aid the next person who was to receive the notebook in terms of their thinking about going about constructing a building or constructing certain kinds of new forms of architecture, new forms of buildings. So the lessons of the past, I think, are very useful for thinking about how knowledge can be circulated and what drives new forms of specialization and systematization, which I'm going to come on to in a minute. So Young and Muller have pointed out that there are two principal kinds of specialized knowledge that we might need to be concerned with. And very importantly, that these have integrated ever further from the Enlightenment onwards, at least in what we might call the industrialized world. So they talk about knowledge specialized to develop conceptually, which aims to extend the generality and conceptuality of knowledge. But they also talk about knowledge specialized to a contextual purpose, which seeks to arrive at a more elegant or efficient solution to a technical problem. And certainly that second definition, I'm sure, will resonate with many of us interested in vocational and professional occupations, where often a lot of the knowledge that's considered most useful is developed through case studies or problems that practitioners are seeking to solve in their workplaces. So what Young and Muller suggest is that there's an intertwining, an integration of these different types of knowledge, that they're, if you like, spurring each other on, that they're not operating in separate tracks at all, but actually are in constant relation with each other. And I think that's an important lesson to bear in mind for how we think about specialization. And it's also important to acknowledge that specialized knowledge is a broad concept. There are multiple forms of specialization in different societal contexts. Randall Collins's book is a very lengthy discussion of different types of different developments in specialized knowledge in different societies around the world historically, looking at China, India, and other places around the world. And many forms of specialized knowledge, we could argue, are considered subversive, remain on the margins of societies, challenging accepted practices and understandings, and may be held by people who aren't necessarily considered to be influential or in positions of power, and therefore they may be excluded from some of the discussions about what constitutes important knowledge for society. So are emerging forms of specialized vocational knowledge adequately recognized? This is certainly a case when we think about the vocational curriculum and we think about the way in which activity in the labor market changes, activity in the economy changes, new forms of work develop, and new forms of specialization develop. Are those involved in documenting the vocational curriculum, organizing the vocational curriculum, aware of those, adequately recognizing them, and understanding which aspects of those forms of specialized knowledge are particularly important for our learners. I think it's also very important to recognize that specialized knowledge, induction into specialized knowledge, requires some form of pedagogic relations. It's often, I think, assumed that people can pick up specialized knowledge as they go along, and there are many long-standing arguments about the extent to which people can learn independently, learn autonomously. I think we could make a very good argument that certainly at a novice stage, at an early stage, forms of pedagogic relations are very important in most, if not all, forms of specialized knowledge. Those with sufficient initiation into specialized knowledge are therefore able to better understand judgments that have been made, evaluations that have been made, decisions that have been made that have significance for occupations in society. It can be quite difficult for somebody who's not fully inducted into a specialized knowledge base to understand judgments and to make those judgments. And a further point to make before I move on to systematic knowledge in a bit more depth is to say that specialized knowledge is all around us. It's everywhere in our world. We're all making use of specialized knowledge all the time in different ways. So I've got the example here of a cleaner, Harpic, which was actually mentioned in the discussion in the London Review of Education, which is why I've kind of carried it forward into this presentation here. A powerful cleaner contains a product which has been manufactured by people with a certain degree of specialized knowledge. And those who have specialized knowledge of the chemistry within that product will have a better understanding than the average person in the street as to what that product can do, the risks that might be brought about by using that product incorrectly, the potential damage to health. And therefore, some of those specialists will be well placed to put together on the back of that carton some basic instructions about how it should be used and how it shouldn't be used, which those of us who are not fully inducted into that specialized knowledge are able to follow. So we're all acquainted with and make use of various forms of specialized knowledge in our daily lives, but I think it's very important to recognize that qualified, competent or expert practitioners are better able to make judgments about the use of specialized knowledge, and we may need to refer to them and to know who we should refer to for assessments of how certain types of specialized knowledge should be used and applied. Oh, gone forward too many. Right, so I come on now to the issue of systematic knowledge. So what do we mean by systematic knowledge and how does it relate to this issue of specialized knowledge? Well, I think there's at least two interpretations. of systematic knowledge that we might hold. So we might make the argument that systematic knowledge is about the systematic arrangement of webs of propositions held together by inferential relations, which make each proposition meaningful in the context of other propositions. If you like, a kind of arrangement or web of knowledge which makes sense or has greater resonance and greater meaning if considered in its entirety. That's not to say that such a systematic knowledge base is in any way static. New insights may transform the existing web of inferential relations, reconfiguring them into a new arrangement. So we can see examples of that in the history of thought in different disciplines, where new insights, new claims or new understandings have come into being, been verified by those involved with the knowledge base, and that's transformed the existing systematic knowledge into something slightly different. So that's one possible interpretation of systematic knowledge. I think the other one, which is particularly important, is to think about systematization of knowledge as meaning making it more explicit through some form of codification, multiplying the potential usages of the knowledge. So somehow putting the knowledge into a form so it can be circulated and transmitted to wider groups of people in different forms. And with ongoing technological development, it's been possible to codify and endlessly recategorize and organize data in ways that would have been previously unimaginable. And that process of systematization doesn't necessarily mean that the knowledge base holds together in a systematic way as it would in definition 1. It might potentially result in some fragmentation of the knowledge base and the knowledge distributing itself in different directions or being used in multiple new ways that might have been inconceivable to those who've been originally involved in producing such knowledge. However, the systematization process may reinforce specialization. I think we could make that argument in the sense that it can distribute the knowledge in forms that can be agreed by wider groups of people at greater speed, so that claims can be evaluated and qualified by wider groups of people, some of whom may never have met each other, or many of whom have never come into contact with each other. So a classic example, I suppose, of this is the rise of electronic publication, the move from the printed form to the electronic form, distribution of knowledge through university libraries or other sources, journals, etc., etc. So wide range of people can read and evaluate the claims that are made within publications. So systematicity, I think we could argue, may enable us to put into practice certain kinds of evaluation of the suitability of new knowledge for inclusion in the existing body of systematic specialized knowledge. So those who have a degree of procedural know-how are equipped to apply procedures judiciously to make reasonable judgments about whether a new claim to knowledge can be admitted into the existing knowledge base. So once we have knowledge more explicitly documented and codified, agreed, we can distribute it and apply certain kinds of criteria to evaluate it. And that's what we might call the process of the development of systematic revisability, the possibility at least of a continual iterative evaluation of knowledge, bearing in mind, of course, all the time that procedures and criteria may be more or less judiciously applied at any point in time and in any context. And what counts as revision or systematic in the context of any community responsible for a knowledge base must be open to scrutiny. An important aspect of this is not only the evaluation of new claims, but also decisions about what types of specialized knowledge may be less specialized than they once were and less important than they once were, that now have become in some way redundant and may need to be discarded from the knowledge base. So I think this is a particularly important question to ask in the context of groups responsible for developing the vocational curriculum, although it's just as true for professional, for all occupations, I would say, as it is for academic disciplines as well. Is this process of systematic revisability being undertaken? Are we putting into practice in a fair and reasonable way some form of criteria that can be applied to evaluate the existing claims to knowledge. Finally, I'm coming close to the end here, but a point I'd like to make is also about systems themselves and the distinction between closed and open systems. Whereas a closed system operates deterministically, open or recursive systems are much more iterative. They respond, if you like, to external factors. In terms of knowledge and the socio-epistemic system in which knowledge is evaluated and validated, we could make the argument that a much more closed system suggests insularity, refusal to accommodate novelty, or to include new contributors or processes of revision. But if we have a much more open or iterative system, processes are prepared to adapt to change, listen to novel claims, and to include contributors who may challenge existing perspectives. So we probably need to aim, certainly in the vocational and professional sphere, for a very much an open system, which nevertheless is rigorous in its evaluation of new claims and thinking through what the possibilities are of the influence of external factors. So my final slide suggests, what does this mean for the curriculum? I think my central point is that I think we need to encourage all of those involved with the vocational curriculum to reflect on the changing nature of specialisation and systematisation and the practice of systematic revisability in their fields, and what constitutes systematic revisability and how we might get there where it doesn't exist already, and who or what is included in those processes. And to keep an open mind towards the non-systematic, bearing in mind my earlier point about the ongoing iteration of specialisation and a critical eye on what has already been systematised and codified in curriculum documents and standards, because some of it may need to be discarded. And I'll wrap up there.
Okay, thank you, Jim. That's an interesting, complex start to today's discussion. And I don't yet see any questions in the chat. So, Jim, I'll ask you a question. In your last slide, you talk about what does this mean for the curriculum? And I guess that's advice for people who are actually in the field of vet and their approaches to the curriculum. But I've got a slightly different question. What do you think the implications are for researchers? What do you think it is that people who are interested in understanding the knowledge that underpins or doesn't underpin or challenges the vet curriculum, what do you think are the most useful activities for researchers to engage in now? Is this just a process of thinking these issues through, and should we be burying ourselves in the texts? And if so, what texts do you think might throw further light, or do you think there's empirical work to be done?
Oh, certainly, yeah. No, it's a good question, Bill, and I think there certainly is empirical work that could be done, looking at the process of, for example, the establishment of apprenticeship standards, the use of apprenticeship standards. I'm talking specifically about England here, but the same might be true in a range of countries around the world. Just to give one example, so I mean, in England, we've seen the rise of this notion of apprenticeship standards replacing the previous frameworks, and I think that's a process that has involved a number of different participants in various ways, and may have excluded some other voices. For example, some vocational practitioners or expert teachers in those vocational areas. So what does that suggest about the way in which the knowledge base, vocational knowledge base in apprenticeship is going? You know, we could, researchers could undertake some interesting empirical studies, I think, interviewing those who have been involved in the development of apprenticeship standards and how they see them being used, how they are being used in practice in terms of the vocational curriculum. So that's one area. certainly there's potential for considerable empirical research looking at the notion of systematic revisability and how it works in practice, and taking this a little bit away from the conceptual terrain and into sort of more detailed empirical studies.
Oh, thanks for that, Jim. That's quite a specific answer. Thanks for that, very helpful. And we got a question from Tyler Furlong now, who says, Jim, how are the processes of literacy practices, reading, writing, speaking, listening, involved in working or reworking knowledge in the individual or in the group?
Well, I mean, they're particularly significant when you have explicit knowledge codified in textual form, I would argue. Yeah, I mean, it's literacy can be a prerequisite for engaging in a number of those practices, and that can in itself cause problems and could lead to certain people feeling that they are excluded from processes like systematic revisability and engaging with criteria, judging new claims to knowledge. Absolutely. I mean, I'm not quite sure if that's, one of the things that might lie behind that question, but I would certainly want to make that point. And that wouldn't have necessarily been the case in the past, where perhaps the knowledge base might have been discussed or deliberated over in different ways that might not have involved certain levels of literacy.
Yes, I wonder whether behind the question is the issue of to what extent can the weakness of literacy practices be a barrier to developing vocational knowledge in new ways?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it can be. And I mean, we're certainly those people involved in academic fields depend on high levels of literacy for the production of academic knowledge in general, not exclusively, but in general. Doesn't apply to every single academic field. If you move into the vocational field, I think, yeah, I mean, we've got so many different vocational practices involving so many different types of activity, and we need to balance out literacy with other aspects, if you like, of demonstrating expertise.
Okay, that's great. Jim, we're on a really tight schedule today, and I'm afraid that's all the questions that we've got time for. Maybe we'll come back to some of these issues.
It's quite all right, Bill. I'm very happy to leave it there and look forward to the next presentations.
Lovely. And that presentation comes from Chris Winch. So without ado, over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Bill. And thank you, Jim, for that excellent presentation. What I've got to say follows on, I think, pretty closely from what's already been put forward in Jim's presentation. I'm just trying to get this to move forward. It doesn't seem to be happening.
I think if you ask
oh yes, there it is. Is that it? No. I don't know what's happened here.
Then the organisers may be able to do that for you if you ask them.
Oh, click the mouse. Okay, right. Here we go. That's it. So I'm going to start by talking about the importance of professional judgment. It's an issue which is not discussed as much as it should be, but it's a really important one for reasons that I hope to show. And incidentally, in my presentation, I've put in red script where I think the issues are particularly important for VET. So what is the importance of professional judgment? Well, I'll start by saying we judge people's acts by the underlying motives and reasons for which they're performed. And that includes the judgments that we take them to make prior to and during action. And closely related to this, we take into account that the reasons that people offer for their actions, because that gives us an insight into the kind of judgments that they're making. And this point applies to professional as well as to everyday action. So my question is, what should the role of vocational education and training be in developing the capacity for professional judgment? Judgment is not something mysterious. Maybe that's one reason why educators tend to shy away from it. It's thought to be something occult and inaccessible that goes on in people's heads. And I don't think that's actually the case. I'm drawing on intellectual resources here based on the work of Lev Vygotsky, the figure on the top right, and Peter Geach, the philosopher at the bottom, whose book, Mental Acts, published in 1957, I think, has not received the recognition that it's due. So using this kind of framework developed independently by Vygotsky and Geach, I suggest that our ability to make judgments arises out of our everyday upbringing. As we learn to speak, we learn to assert statements. Later, we learn to articulate our thoughts sotto voce, and then we do what you might call, I think what Vygotsky calls inner speech, where you might articulate a sentence to yourself. But we learn to do other things as well. We learn to speculate as to what might happen in certain circumstances. And we also learn to justify the reasoning behind our practices. So when we're asked, why did you do that? Even as young children, we learn to try and give an account of our reasons and why we decided to do things in the way that we did. So these are the linguistic practices that underlie our capacity for judgment. Let's first of all look at everyday judgment, because everyday judgment is a presupposition of being able to get anyone to judge professionally. So in our ordinary lives, all of us, to the extent that we have a certain degree of independence of action, the ability to choose alternatives and means to ends that are either self-determined or determined by others is really important. And in doing so, we learn to take account of the needs of other people. We learn to try to act for good reasons wherever possible. And we learn to evaluate the actions of others as well. And these are all prerequisites, I suggest, for developing professional judgment. And they require a certain degree of maturity. So how does professional judgment differ from the everyday situation? I don't think one can make hard and fast distinctions here, but I would like to draw attention to some characteristic features of judgment in professional situations that perhaps ought to be a focus of our attention. So, for example, decisions which are not easily rectified once action has been taken. You need to get it right first time. Wrong decisions can often lead to serious negative consequences. Think, for example, of safety critical occupations here. Situational awareness in the workplace, whatever the workplace might be, and it might not just be in a building, it could be in the cabin of a locomotive or an aircraft. It can be in all sorts of places. Situational awareness is very important for professional judgment. But so also, as Jim reminds us, so also are theoretical considerations. And very often there's an issue about integrating this situational with the theoretical, which is a characteristic feature of professional judgment. And last but not least, there are often very serious constraints of the amount of knowledge available to you, time to act and think, resources, and so on. And all of these have got to be integrated into professional judgment. So one can see that potentially professional judgment is a very complex affair and needs to be prepared for. So why is systematic and theoretical knowledge important? Again, this covers some of the ground that Jim does, coming at it from a slightly different angle. But occupations are, as has been pointed out, very often based on theoretical and systematic knowledge. And this is particularly the case where you move away from the routine and you assume a degree of professional autonomy in the worker. You're expected to make your own decisions, your own planning, and to justify what you've done. Theoretical knowledge is important because it at least aims to be comprehensive relative to the occupational field and can cover cases not within the practitioner's experience. The practitioner does not have to encounter every kind of situation that they may come across in the course of their career, but they can learn how to deal with it through theoretical knowledge. And very often, the autonomous practitioner will come across unexpected and unusual situations and will need to draw on resources which are not purely situational and not purely experiential in order to do so. So theoretical knowledge is very important in professional judgment. Let's have a look at the elements of judgment in decision making. And this is an ideal case. Very often, as I say, these stages are compressed in so-called operational conditions. But we can at least distinguish between considering alternative courses of action, selecting a preferred option, making a decision to act, and actually acting. As I say, sometimes these are compressed, but if we're looking in more detail at someone's decision making, we may want to separate out these different factors. I also want to draw your attention to hypothetical judgment. We very often need to consider how we would act in certain counterfactual circumstances. Now, this might be part of planning, and it might be a way of testing somebody's theoretical and practical judgment abilities, or it might simply be a part of being prepared for eventualities. And particularly, I think, when one is preparing people for action in the workplace, it may well occur away from the hot action or the actual operational conditions where one is making decisions in a constrained context. And that's important for considering vocational education and the kind of pedagogy that's appropriate here. Is there a place for more theoretical reflection, or maybe simulation or controlled conditions, so that some of the factors involved in operational conditions are mitigated and people can gain confidence in a relatively safe environment? I also want to draw your attention to professional judgment after the event. We make judgments during events, but very often we're asked to justify what we've done or to think about, reflect on what we've done. Obviously, this occurs in serious situations where there's been an allegation of professional misconduct, or there's been a serious accident or something like that. But it's, you might argue, good practice that we do this anyway. We rehearse the reasons for action, maybe using the schema mentioned above, and we can then make judgments about the quality of the reason and the decision making. This reflection is often difficult during hot action. I've always been rather skeptical about the idea of reflection in action. By its nature, a lot of the action we're involved in doesn't allow the time for reflection. But post hoc reflection can be a powerful means of learning, done either individually or collectively, and should have its place in a vocational education program. As indeed should problem solving, which again is a key feature of autonomous professional action. It's to be distinguished from just improvising to suit different circumstances. Even if one is practicing a relatively routine skill, one has to adapt one's performance to particular circumstances. But I'm not talking about that kind of situation. I'm talking about circumstances where the agent is finding a way to do something, not adapting a skill to new circumstances. And in these kinds of circumstances, powers of judgment, often exercised collectively, not just individually, need to be brought to bear on the situation. And as I've said before, this will often involve bringing to bear theoretical as well as situational considerations. And again, going back to that idea of pedagogy of the safe space, one can look at these kinds of situations through simulations and scenarios before actually having to solve problems in real life workplace situations. To get away from skills for a moment, which I guess is a lot of the staple of vocational education, we shouldn't forget transversal abilities. And these include such activities, such abilities as planning, being able to plan, to control the process, to coordinate different aspects of a process, to communicate with others, and to evaluate what we've done. And they're typically exercised in autonomous action. They're not skills, or they may involve skills. They can be realized in different ways. I can plan and I can communicate using different arrays of skills. And there's a focus on the ends, not just on the means. In other words, if I'm asked to be communicating effectively, I focus on what I'm trying to get across to the audience I'm considering. I don't just think about the skills that I'm using when I'm communicating. And there needs to be a place for these transversal abilities in VET, and all too many programs you see ignore them. And they're closely related to the idea of project management. Autonomous work involves the ability to plan and control, modify and evaluate an extended complex of tasks, resulting in a defined output. This involves the articulated exercise of transversals and problem-solving abilities. And evidently, it's a complex ability that needs to be acquired and cannot be done in the heat of operational conditions. Again, you need a safe pedagogic space in which to develop your ability to manage projects. And of course, in the workplace, judgment is very often constrained. We're working under limitations of resources, time, information, and so on. And bearing in mind that judgment in professional situations can have serious consequences, again, practice and instruction need to be given into judging under constraint. And again, one needs a relatively safe environment initially in order to do this. So let's move on to the integration of the elements of judgment. I've already hinted that professional judgment can be a very complex affair, not just because of the exigencies of the workplace, which can be very severe, but also it involves integrating proximal factors like the situation you're in and its constraints, the abilities and needs of colleagues, and immediate consequences with distal factors like the theoretical underpinning of the decisions that one is proposing to make, the long-term consequences of what you're doing, and the bigger picture. So, for example, if one's involved in a house building project, which involves low energy construction, you need to have in your mind as well the overall objective, which is to minimize energy consumption, not just your own little bit of the work, the plumbing or the insulation or whatever it might be. The development of these integrating abilities in judgment involves instruction, practice in both simulatory and control circumstances initially, and reflection on performance. And they need themselves to be planned as an articulated sequence over a period of a VET program. Oops. There we are. So my last slide is just some suggestions for what VET needs to do to develop professional judgment. And I've got some 5 points here. You need to be clear about the aims of the program. There should be an explicit intent to involve capacities that allow for autonomous action in the workplace. An adequate theoretical background needs to be provided in the program, together with plenty of practical opportunities. One needs to think carefully about the sequence of moving from the classroom to a simulation, to controlled circumstances, to operational conditions. One needs to provide opportunity for considering hypothetical situations, and one needs to allow for plenty of reflection, both individual and collective. Thank you. And yes, so unlike Jim's paper, this one was fairly closely based on that journal article, Forming and Exercising Professional Judgment. And I'll hand over to you again there, Bill. Thanks.
Chris, thank you very much for that. It's really interesting. And we do have a couple of questions. Is problem solving a general skill? As we sometimes say about problem solving as a generic skill, as though we can teach everybody a sequence of behaviours that will enable them to solve problems. Or are there different problem solving skills specific to each field of practice? It's managing a building project, the same as restoring the supply of fuel. I would have thought restoring the supply of fuel was a faster problem to resolve, although now we have problems of fuel supply that appear to be going on for a long time in the UK. But let's not digress. What do you think, Chris? Is this specific, or are there general principles that everybody should be learning?
Thank you, Bill. That's an important question, and my answer briefly would be that it's the latter. Problem solving, as I suggested, involves bringing together experience, one's sizing up, if you like, of the situation that one's in, and theoretical considerations relevant to this kind of problem. And all those points tend to suggest that problem solving is not a general ability, as PISA, for example, would have it. It's related very closely to fields of knowledge and occupational fields. That said, there may be elements of one's problem-solving ability which have a degree of transfer. And I'm thinking in particular of some of the dispositions and virtues, if you like, that you may develop in trying to solve problems, such as patience, the ability not to panic when faced with a difficulty, and a preparedness to consult with other people, for example. Those may carry over into other activities.
Okay, thanks for that. We've had a comment from Jim in the chat here saying hot action is needed to restore the fuel supply around here. Although I'm not sure that there hasn't been a little too much hot action.
Yes, that's right.
You're on mute, sorry.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Can now, yeah.
Oh, right. Okay. Yes. I mean, that's it. That's an interesting example. And I suppose one could say that you need to consider hypothetical situations, like what happens if very tight supply chains break down or become fragile? What kind of contingency planning is done with that? Then you don't have to solve the problem on the hoof, but you've got something to fall back on. Will we reflect on that later? That's an interesting point. I'd be very interested to see in the aftermath of this crisis whether the reflection actually does take place. I'm not entirely confident about it.
Okay, thanks for that, Chris. That's excellent presentation. We just got another question come in. So, transversals and many other areas of developing expertise involve significant literacy processes. which are not made explicit. Are they key in vocational education? This is a thing we came to with Jim. So
yes, it's a similar issue to the one that Jim faced in his questions, and I suppose the answer is that in order to do a lot of the things that you need to do in order to gain professional judgment, literacy and numeracy can be very important. If you have to have a systematic and serious engagement with the knowledge that underlies your profession, it's quite difficult to see how it's possible to do that without resources of a reasonable level of literacy and numeracy. And I think this is a really important issue. And it's not just a UK issue. I think even in countries like Germany, where the kind of thing I've been talking about does receive higher salience and where the transversals are explicitly recognized, a lot of young people still have to go through a transition program before they reach the educational level which allows them to take part in an apprenticeship program. And I do worry more than a little bit about the readiness of young people to take T-levels when there will be such high expectations that so many will, given sometimes modest educational achievements, and whether or not we too will need some kind of extensive transitional system to help young people onto such programs.
Chris, that's a really interesting question that certainly deserves more discussion in quite a few places. But we're out of time now. We have to move remorselessly on. And we have to move on to Aina and Judith with their presentation on training, knowledge and the organisation of secondary schooling. Chris, thanks so much.
Yeah. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much. I'm Aina Taravini, and she's Judith Jakobkis. And yeah, our paper, as you can see, is entitled Tracking Knowledge and the Organization of Secondary Schooling, Teachers' Representations and Expectations. Okay. Just 1 minute, sorry. Okay, yes, now. So this paper is developed within a research tradition that has produced plenty of evidence that tracking, and particularly the division between academic and vocational tracks that feature most part of European education systems, has a critical role in explaining the production and the reproduction of social inequalities, particularly social class inequalities, even if not solely, of course. So within this framework of tracking inequality, academic and vocational divide, and class production and reproduction, our analysis aims to further investigate this relationship between tracking and social inequality by focusing particularly on the distribution of knowledge between tracks and on the effects this knowledge distribution generates on a student's opportunities to succeed in a school, particularly in secondary school. To do so, our analysis focuses on the way teachers explain, represent, legitimize, justify this relationship, and particularly aims on the one hand to providing a thick description of the attributes assigned to vocational and academic knowledge, and on the other hand, to identify the mechanisms explaining this segmented distribution of knowledge between tracks as represented in teachers' discourses, experiences, and narratives. So, in terms of the methodology, we have conducted 72 in-depth interviews with principals, pedagogic coordination teams, and teachers, tutors in 8 secondary schools in Barcelona, Spain. Of course, this amount of interviews were conducted by Judith and myself, plus 4 other researchers The 6 of us were working together under a collaborative research project during 5 years, but the coding and the analysis of these interviews for the objectives of these papers were completely developed by the 2 of us. Specifically, we analyzed these interviews by means of critical discourse analysis, because we understand that teachers' discourses not only represent the social reality, the educational reality, but these discourses are also productive. They produce, they legitimize, they establish this reality. In fact, we assume there is an interactive, bidirectional relationship between social structures and the discourses produced within these structures. Particularly, the Spanish education system, just very briefly, in order for you to understand the context, is based on what Andrea Walters defines as a subprotective transition regime that is mainly featured, among other elements, by a comprehensive lower secondary education until the end of 16, a tracked organization of upper secondary schooling, and a very low historical development of intermediate bed. Likewise, these upper secondary tracks that in Spain are 2 tracks, the academic, the baccalaureate, and the bed, the intermediate bed, are, as you will see during our presentation, strongly segmented, both in terms of their functions, in terms of their social compositions, in terms of the typologies of the supply, and so on and so forth. So we understand that this segmentation establishes the frame of reference to organize teachers' voices, teacher relationships, teacher practices, teacher narratives. So before going into the results of our analysis, we would like to ask you to answer a poll that supposedly it's appearing somewhere in your chat or in your presentation. I cannot see the link right now, but in any case, let me explain very briefly what is the objective of this poll. And if it's not clear, okay, I need to go to the next slide. In this poll, you have to do the following brief exercise. You have to list a maximum of 3 types of knowledge, or a maximum of 3 types of attributes, or you can either combine them. I don't want to give you too many explanations or too many examples, because I don't want to condition you, but just very in an intuitive manner, without thinking too deep. Exactly. Try to do things like that: implicit, explicit, mathematical, artistical, easy, difficult. So types of knowledges or types of features that come to your mind in order to characterize knowledge and tracks. So if this poll, if this exercise works, in our screen should appear in some minutes this kind of attributes, features, knowledges that will give us a first image of the kind of results we will present to you. So I will remain silent for some minutes in order for the seconds, for the screen to be filled. Okay, so thank you very much. Maybe some of you are still working on that, but in order to have time for presenting the results, just let me comment briefly on this graph. As you can see here, just in these 2 seconds, multiple ways of naming, defining knowledges, multiple attributes, multiple features appear here. It's very relevant that the name theoretical are in the center of this screen. We will elaborate on that in a minute. Linguistic, practical, tactical, technical, concrete, social, embodied, intuitive, factual, imaginative, all these kind of knowledges, all these kinds of attributes are connected with taken for granted assumptions, normalized discourses in our society that are connected to the structure of the labor market, to the dominant notions of learning, abilities, and so on and so forth. So what we want to do now is trying to show you how teachers in our sample also used in a very naturalized manner this kind of attributions, of classifications of knowledges and their characteristics. So I'm moving into the results of our presentation just to connect this brief exercise with the first part of the results of our analysis. So just I need to move my presentation now. Okay, so yeah, very briefly, what our analysis demonstrates is that teachers in global terms have a highly naturalizing conception of knowledge that is broadly articulated around this dichotomy where the practical theoretical divide, as in our scheme appear, is central to explain the articulation and a distribution of knowledge between tracks. I will show you some examples in a minute. But this dichotomy, this conception of different knowledge for different tracks is not only descriptive, as I will show you as well in a second, is above all normative, is analytic, is identifying different scales of prestige that assigns different attributes, difficult, easy, funny, boring, to different kinds of knowledges as if they were inevitable, not connected to the broader social and educational inequalities. And finally, it generates an articulation between different knowledges and different attributes that are discursively articulated around different kinds of metaphors that we will show you around dirty and clean kinds of knowledges, passive and active kinds of work activities that again generates this discursive hierarchization among knowledges and tracks. So just very briefly to give time to Judith to explain also our results. Here, for example, I'm just reading these BET coordinators, baccalaureate coordinators just said, in contrast with the baccalaureate, BET has a much more practical curriculum oriented towards solving specific problems. On the contrary, the main feature of the International Baccalaureate, that is the most selected one in our country, is to provide our students with critical thinking, with reflection, with research. So this dichotomy between theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge as baccalaureate and BET is very naturalized. Moreover, as I said, this is linked to attributes such as difficult, easy, connected to the notion of culture, to potentials of different knowledges to be accessed by different kinds of students. And for example, this tutor, I'm going to the second quotation, says, it is difficult to imagine anything less demanding than BET. So in a very negative way, he is referring to BET knowledge even as if this were no knowledge at all. Finally, I will show you this last quotation that is in this first part of the result. I'm trying to show you, as I said at the beginning, this description of the attributes, the metaphors, the connection between knowledges and tracks. Then Judith will go deeper into the explanation and the mechanism explaining that. But here, for example, you will see how these metaphors, dirty, clean, passive, active, routine, innovation, are applied to different knowledges to mark them in terms of prestige. For example, a painter or a doctor, as we will see in this example, has dirty hands because they use painting or they are using blood. But this is not signaled like dirty. But worker is clearly identified as a dirty profession, as dirty hands. So here we can read a doctor works with his hands, yes, but his material is human being, their lives. Getting dirty at work is connected with the history of social classes. Those who get dirty, those who risk their lives, those who do not enjoy their work are the lower classes. So to end this first part of the results, what our analysis try to demonstrate is that it's important to deconstruct how the features, the metaphors, the attributes assigned to different kinds of knowledges not only express what is happening in the reality, but also generates a reality in terms of knowledge distribution for different tracks.
So what I will try to do in this second part is to approach the ways teachers explain these features Aina told you. How do they explain such a polarization between these tracks and between the knowledge they attach to each of them? So we have identified three main mechanisms they use to explain this polarization, and a transversal axis which contributes to explain the connection between these three mechanisms. So first, I'm going to explain the function of the tracks as viewed by teachers, which connects with the second, that is the grammar of lower secondary schooling through the social composition of each track. And finally, the last mechanism is the different learning cultures of each of the tracks. Sorry. Yeah. As this following quotation shows, and it has been demonstrated largely by the literature in the field, baccalaureate is designed as a generalist track aimed to access higher education, whilst VET is aimed at ensuring a quick insertion into the labor market to their students. And this is an assumption which is absolutely accepted by teachers in both of the tracks. A VET tutor told us in the first quotation, our philosophy in VET is to prepare students to access labor market. If they want to continue studying, that's okay, but it's not our main goal. And the other say the baccalaureate is aimed at continuing formal study, at accessing higher education, but in VET, our role is to prepare students for the professional world. So this clear attribution of functions somehow colludes with what we have seen in other researches and other analysis of political discourses around VET, which consider VET another way to access higher education, as sometimes as a means to prestige it. Then reflecting on the explanations around these different functions, interviewees bring up the relationship between the functions and the social composition of each of the tracks. The following examples describe VET students not as good students, but as restless, lazy, disruptive, etc. And they connect these attitudes or behaviors to the opposition these students expressed towards theoretical knowledge and the very school culture in the previous schooling stages. So teachers here highlight the need they have to focus on the basics to improve these soft skills of the students. This is shown in the first quotation. And in addition, and connecting with the second mechanism we will present now, teachers stress the discomfort these students feel with regards to both the content and the organization of lower secondary education. This vet tutor told us our students are very resistant to curricular content that is more theoretical. They struggle a lot with this kind of knowledge. They are very lazy. And so what we have seen is precisely that the grammar of lower secondary schooling is maybe the most important of the mechanisms the teachers use or recognize when it comes to explain this segmentation between the knowledge that tracks are addressed to. In Spain, the academic orientation of lower secondary education is very, very strong. And as the extent research on early school living shows, the disconnection with the contents and with the methods of transmission of this content is one of the key factors for explaining the high percentage of young students who drop out school after finishing or before finishing lower secondary education. So they do not feel competent in almost none of the subjects that are important, that are recognized for the curriculum at this stage. A tutor in baccalaureate expressed it this way: we cannot accept that math should be considered difficult almost by nature. We need to rethink how we transmit this knowledge. In addition, the grammar of secondary schooling fails to incorporate those forms of knowledge and pedagogies which are more common in VET. That is barely explained in lower secondary education, except to those students who are at risk of failing. So somehow the baccalaureate is constructed following the same structure than lower secondary education, and thus transmitting an idea of a natural track like a whole in which baccalaureate is the natural following of lower secondary education, whilst VET is an exception, this track for those students who do not fit in the norm. So finally, the last mechanism identified by teachers point to differences between the learning cultures at its track, and somehow problematize or contributes to problematize this rather linear connection between baccalaureate and theoretical and practical and VET we have presented before, because as shown by the following quotations, VET teachers state that the main feature of VET is precisely its articulation between theory and practice, and in line with what Chris has shown before. Our interviewer said, we need theory, it is essential to make sense of our practice. Or another quotation, the craft person is someone who controls, who decides what product they want to make. So practical knowledge is relevant, of course, in this track, but is not the only knowledge. It does not imply the absence of theory. On contrary, as indicated by many researchers, the articulation between theory and practice is precisely one of the most salient features of the vocational curriculum. So critical voices regarding the dispossession of theoretical contents in VET are common across our interviews, and in baccalaureate there are also critical voices, although not as many, that complain about the orientation to the test for accessing higher education that baccalaureate is adopting, rather than developing critical, complex theoretical knowledge. So just as a conclusion, let me highlight four main ideas. First, that the uneven prestige of theoretical and practical knowledge is attached to their different attributed difficulties. Second, that according to teachers, the functions and the social composition of the tracks contribute to explain the dichotomized knowledge provision in VET and baccalaureate. Third, that the connections between the grammar of lower secondary education and baccalaureate contribute to this construction of a normal or correct track, and of a normal or correct way of being a student, and therefore favors a progressive exclusion of the ability to excel for those students who do not fit in this definition. And finally, that these dichotomies, which are institutionalized, are not uncritically assumed by teachers in any of the two tracks. And sorry for being such in a rush to end the presentation. You can find the full analysis published in the Journal of Vocational Education and Training. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Colleagues, thanks so much. And you know, although we keep saying it's a time-constrained exercise, I appreciate that Judith especially was a bit short of time. So let's not take away your time for questions, particularly because we have some interesting ones. Not that the previous questions weren't interesting too. Okay, so two questions, and I'd like to begin with the second one. They're both from James Davis. Have you encountered any resistance amongst teachers or students to the reproductive processes and the reproductive discourses, I would say, that you've reported? You know, your study's very much located in a reproductive discourse amongst VET teachers. But isn't there also did you also find resistance? And can you tell us something about that?
Very nice question. As the same question incorporates an element around teachers and an element around students, maybe we can, do you want to talk about teachers and I can talk about students? Okay, so you can start maybe.
Okay. Teachers are very constrained in their practices, and they need to fulfill, mostly in vocational education and training, a very closed curriculum. They cannot innovate a lot in terms of the content they transmit, but in the methods. And in fact, the most innovative or creative, more than innovative, creative practices to go further what the curriculum specifies are in VET, not in baccalaureate in Spain. We see that the teachers in VET tend to be much more reflective on their work, and much more, and they look for much more ways to access further interests of their students, but they find strong resistance both in terms of the institutionalization of the curriculum and in the characteristics of the students. And then I pass.
No, really interesting question. This paper, as we have explained, focus on teachers, but on another paper, we have been working precisely on how VET students reconstruct their learner identity, precisely studying VET, because they experience, in most of the cases, they experience in lower secondary education, it's a bad school experience. They feel they are bad students, they feel studying is not for them, and they particularly feel they are not good for theoretical knowledge. And this is absolutely interiorized in their narratives. So they select VET not only for that, but as the only track where they can be themselves. So what is interesting in their narratives is that when they are studying VET, they start reconciling with themselves as proper knowledge. They start seeing that maybe they are not so bad as they were told. And then it's not only about the kind of knowledge, but also as the way this knowledge is transmitted. And when they are connected, when the knowledge transmission is making any sense for their lives, for their present, for their futures, they can be as good and as any other. So in terms of the potential suggestions to the curriculum changing, what we anticipate in our research is that there is room for creating a curriculum in lower secondary education that combines different kinds of knowledges and different kinds of knowledge transmissions, evaluations, and realizations, because this is not neutral, and also articulates a kind of VET provision that goes into the hallmark of BED, that is, as Judith said, an articulation between theory and practice. Because in Spain, and I'm finishing now, as in many other European countries, the recent reforms of BED mainly has eliminated the theoretical contents of the BED curriculum. So this is contradictory, because students at the first sight, they are happy because they are being trained in a curriculum. They feel it's the good for them, the practical one, but they are disempowered because with this curriculum, they won't be only able to access the most precarious labor market positions. So yeah, there is resistance, different kinds of resistances, not linear. Thank you.
Can I ask Jim's question in the chat? You're muted, but I guess I can.
Do you want to say something about the previous question? It's a question about
yeah.
How do the processes you discussed relate to ethnicity or race?
Yeah, in Spain and as in many other countries, social composition of both tracks is extremely uneven, and vocational education and training choices are classed, are gendered, and are ethnified. So sorry for my wording. But yeah, and this is like a vicious cycle that makes it difficult for teachers to address some parts of the more hard curriculum, and at the same time establishes BED as a kind of social net for those who are not able, in the opinion of lower secondary teachers, or because they arrive late and they do not manage well the language or whatever. So this is the only place they can go, and they are accepted to go. And this is very complicated for teachers in vocational education and training to manage these very diverse groups without any resource for doing that. So yeah, it's also a matter of social composition of the tracks.
Yeah, just something to add very briefly to that. As Judith said, BED is clearly class, gendered, and racialized. Our intermediate BED, in general terms, is composed by working class students of migrant background, majority male, depending on the specialities. But it's also important to take into account that there are segmentation between tracks, but also within tracks. And within BED, there are different modalities. For example, there are some BED provisions that are only available in the private sector, and these are completely crowded by middle classes who failed in the baccalaureate. So yeah, in general terms, this is the sharp distribution, but it's very important to see how specific specialities are specifically classed, gender, or racialized, because it's not linear. So yeah.
Okay, that's great. That's a really important point about that kind of stratification within VET itself. Mm-hmm. Really helpful. Thank you. But we're now cutting into the time of our next speaker. So thank you, Anya and Judith. We now have to move on to our final speaker, Gavin Moody.
Thanks very much, Bill, and thanks for your attention. Colleagues, I'll try to abridge my presentation to suit the time available, but here is the question running through it. This is the gunner's question, much studied during the early modern period. Golly. I'll contrast the scholarly literature with practitioner's manual and trade books, and from that derive the argument. So we're most used to this analysis of the origin of practical knowledge. We start with research, which is recontextualized to disciplinary knowledge, which is recontextualized again into pedagogic disciplinary knowledge. This is based on Basil Bernstein's work. We also from disciplinary knowledge, we see it recontextualized as applied disciplinary knowledge, such as physics for engineers or biology for nurses. And then that is taught in the regions in development of practice and then applied to practice. And an example of this I'm taking is scholarly literature on ballistics, we come back to. Now, what I want to do is go the other way, is to examine the processes by which practical knowledge becomes disciplinary knowledge. We have a whole bunch of uncodified knowledge and practice, and I suggest one of the aims of practitioners is to systematize that into established rules of practice, which can then be structured hierarchically and explained theoretically into applied knowledge. And my main argument is that achieving these moves from established rules and practices to systematic procedural knowledge and then to applied knowledge is not simply re-expressing the knowledge for a different context. It is restructuring it to apply to a different epistemic level for a different audience. I'm use as my evidence the new forms of knowledge developed in the early modern period, which started to be codified in various documents, but had not yet been systematized and structured as applied knowledge. And by examining the documents during this period, we can see the process of it being restructured. Here's Valorani's book, which Jim referred to earlier, and there are many fields of rich knowledge generation, complex knowledge-intensive activity, which were being systemized during the early modern period. And I could have chosen any one of these, but I chose artillery for a reason that I'll explain later. And here's a more recent work which examines some of the same issues, the transformation of applied knowledge in these fields. And here the author, Lefebvre, is using contemporary terms to refer to practices in the early modern period. Gunnery is particularly important during this period because although bombards were known almost a century before in Europe, they weren't very effective. They weren't important in warfare until 1495, when the troops of Charles VIII achieved a significant victory using artillery. And this eventually led to the development of textbooks, of artillery schools, and later other texts to try to explain this new technology, which was clearly important at the time and became more so later. So here is the answer from Walton. That was not known at the time, and it was the subject of much speculation in the scholarly literature. And here is some of the signal scholarly texts, most of them printed and in Latin. And this is the frontispiece from Nova Scientia, the first of Renaissance woodchucks that Bill refers to. But firing cannons was so erratic, even trying to keep all of the known variables constant, that scholarly literature was hardly relevant to gunnery practice, and gunnery practice wasn't repeatable enough to inform scholarly literature. So we have a whole bunch of gunners' manuals, and they're like recipe books. Noting that it was up to the practitioner to apply these principles to the different contexts in which they found them. Gunnery at sea is very different to gunnery at land, but it was up to the practitioner to apply this knowledge to their specific context. And mere application to a different context did not involve the systematization or restructuring of this knowledge. And here is another example of a recipe included in the Greek Gunner's Manual. So we have scholarly literature, we have practitioners' manuals, and here we have the emergence of a new kind of text, what we would call nowadays the trade book, not written for scholars. It was in the vernacular, not in Latin, not written for practitioners, because by reading this book, you couldn't work out how to actually fire a cannon, but it was to inform the educated public about this important new technique. And here is the key woodcut. It is one of these trade books illustrating the principle well known amongst practitioners that a cannon fired from a higher elevation went further than a cannon fired from a lower elevation. Now, as the author Buchner explains, there was no need to draw these trajectories. Ufano could have made the same point by simply marking this point, A1, that point, A2, and put another X here, B1, B2. But he chose to draw trajectories. That's the first point. A totally speculative exercise during the early modern periods, because nobody could see the trajectory. Nobody could observe it or measure the trajectory. And this trajectory is taken from an argument from first principles by Aristotle, which says that a forced or projected motion is straight in the line of projection first, and then when gravitation takes over, it is straight down. And so he's got two straight lines with this transition point here. Now, if you just take this curve here and transpose it to the lower level, as Buchner does here, you find that the cannonball lands in the same spot. That's because Ufano is using the wrong trajectory. He should be using a parabola. And had he used a parabola, his illustration would be accurate. Instead, Ufano fudged a bit and drew a different shaped trajectory, as if a cannon fired from a lower point, projected its cannonball in a different trajectory. It does not, of course. And so here's an example of an author trying to illustrate a rule of practice using a scholarly or theoretical framework. And it's this transition of knowledge from one context and one epistemic purpose to another epistemic level that results in the transformation of knowledge from practical to applied. And I thank you for your attention, and look forward to comments and questions.
Gavin, thank you for that well-flighted presentation, and for compressing it a little too. We do have time for questions on this presentation, and we have time for a little general discussion as well, where hopefully we're able to pull some of these threads together and look at the themes that have emerged from the session as a whole. But first of all, what about questions in relation to this? I'm afraid I get the questions with a bit of a delay on the Slido technology. So just while we're waiting for the questions to come in, Gavin, maybe I could begin by asking you a question. Or maybe I could invite you to reflect a little about the periodicity, if that's even the right word, about the period in which these questions about gunnery first became issues. Why do you think at that particular moment, you talked about a particular military event, but how does that relate to economic, commercial, societal contexts for those forms of knowledge to become important? And that, of course, is an invitation for you to think about, what about now? What are the implications for the period that we're going through now, and the forms of knowledge and the way that's emerging now? What's different, and what are the continuities?
Yes, thank you very much. The processes are much more complex now because we have all sorts of frameworks of qualifications, of accreditation, of programs, quality assurance, occupational registration, which disciplines the restructuring of knowledge more than in the early modern period, which lacked those processes. But I believe that there are many areas of practical knowledge which are not supported by strong occupational groups which may recontextualize that knowledge, systematize it, and structure it. And therefore, there is a role for vocational colleges to do that themselves, to take tacit knowledge and make it explicit, to take explicit rules and procedures and systematize it, and to take systematic practical knowledge and structure it into applied knowledge. That seems to me a role, a very valuable role that vocational colleges could play in many fields of practice.
Thanks for that, Gavin. And we've got a couple of questions about, from a Bernsteinian perspective. One question is, what are the recontextualization principles that provide or provided impetus for these processes? I think you touched on that a little in what you've just said, but any thoughts on that, that Bernsteinian description of the recontextualization of knowledge?
Yes, thank you. A difficult question which I have not considered in sufficient depth to provide a more informed answer than the person who asked it.
Okay, and there was a follow-up about what processes of systematic revisability were enacted by the gunners or the brewers. So, in the early modern period, to what extent were the people who were involved in artillery actions, for example, to what extent were they involved in revising those practices? Some of your sources hinted at that, I think.
Absolutely, thanks. Much easier question for me to consider. Where a practitioner, ale brewer or gunner or architect wish to transfer their knowledge to somebody who was contiguous in time and place, somebody right next to them, as in an apprenticeship, there was no need for the expert to systematize the knowledge. But where the expert wishes to transfer the knowledge to somebody in a different place or to somebody in a different time, then it became necessary to change their notes, their aid memoirs, their recipe books into something more systematic. The next stage from a statement of systematic knowledge to a hierarchically structured one didn't tend to be done by the practitioners. It was done by people who knew enough about the practice to be able to re-express it.
Gavin, we've lost your sound.
I turned it off. End of comment.
Okay. Thank you. So we've got one more question, and then if people have more general questions or want to pull some of these themes together, let's try and do that for the last few minutes. But one final question that Tara Furlong raises. Did the incremental scriptural codification of knowledge by individuals in interaction with context and practical experience contribute to better practice? Was the fact that we're able to write about these things a way in which practice moved forward? Or was the things on the ground different from what's taking place in the text that you've described?
Yes, very interesting question. Most of the advances in practice during this period were from technological innovations. So improved cannon, improved mixtures of powder, improved quadrants and measuring devices, and from developing tables of measurements which allowed practitioners to reproduce previous successful results. But the very late development of gunnery schools and textbooks directed towards scholars of gunnery schools suggested that most improvements in practice were developed in the field from practice rather than from systematization of the knowledge.
Okay, thanks for that. We're quite tight on time now, but please, if people have final questions or short observations that they want to post in the chat, then perhaps we can move on to that. Gavin, thank you so much for that early morning presentation for you. We have quite a tight schedule, and of course some of the discussion's been of quite a theoretical nature, as we intend it to be, but it's got important and powerful implications for the world of practice in which so many of us have a continuing involvement. So by all means, if people want to post any comments or quick questions on that. If not, then as we have to end strictly on time, it falls to me to pull together a few of the threads as quickly as I can, and to thank our speakers who have provided such a varied and insightful set of perspectives on these major questions that are facing our field, whether it's empirical, as in Ina and Judith's presentation, whether it's of a more theoretical nature, whether from the philosophical perspectives Chris has brought to the table, or the historical ones that Gavin has. All of these approaches have something to contribute not only to our wisdom, but also to our ability to propose ways that our field of practice and our field of study can go forward. I was really struck by what Judith said about autonomy and the way that practitioners' autonomy is restricted and the limited opportunities they have to make sense of the world around them. And you know, these issues that we've discussed for 2 hours in relation to students on vet pathways are in many ways parallel by the issues facing practitioners. To what extent are they involved in the reproduction of workplace practice, sometimes in ways that can be constrained by the discipline of employment, as well as by the disciplines of educational institutions. A few final comments emerging in the chat. Thank goodness they're comments rather than long and difficult questions. Thanks to the speakers. Jay expressed deal with navigation next, so if somebody does, and thankful and positive comments, Jenny, Kevin, and which I'm sure that other people who've been there have echoed. I'm really grateful to those of our audience who took part, and I hope that everybody found it a valuable session. It's such a rush, and yet fabulous that we're able to put together an international panel like this without everybody having to trudge to a building in London, or fly to one if trudging isn't possible for them. So I hope it's been of value, and I hope you'll join us the next time we get together for an event like this through the BERA Special Interest Group. Thank you everybody for taking part. Really, really grateful to everybody.